And welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Tonight, let's call this part 32 of Mussolini, an Italian American perspective. Okay, guys, tonight I'm going to attempt to very gently deal with the Jewish question in Italy in 1940s. And this one is going to be tough to deal with. One, because of platform issues here. And so I'm going to have to ask my audience here to read between the line at times. Um, this is the only platform I have, and so just be aware of that. That's number one. Number two, no matter what position I take here on the Jewish question, I'm going to get hit by both sides. On one end, if I say that the issue of the Jews in Europe during the World War II period is a little bit nuanced, more nuanced at least than what we've been led on to believe by Western liberal historians, then I get hit right away from people like the ADL, and I'm on their hit list automatically just for suggesting that. If I say that, well, the Nazi regime was overtly brutal toward the Jews, then I get hit by the white boys who tell me that, right, that really um, the Nazis were Christians, were good Christians just trying to protect their country. And there's two battle lines here, right? That's being fought. And I think the big problem, of course, is that we're not allowed to really have this discussion in a nuanced way historically, because the question is political to this day. It's purposely divisive in order to keep us again arguing with each other because of modern political democratic sensibilities. And so even dealing with this, and this is why I've actually have avoided talking about the Jewish issue in Italy for the longest time, because how I frame this discussion is really, it's going to be difficult to maneuver. And some people say, Frank, well, just say it directly, just say what you believe. Well, it's complex. That's the issue. And so, and on top of it all, we have censorship in America. The land of the free, right? Land of the brave, land of the free. We have censorship. So let me see if I could maneuver through this, right? And explain to you exactly what the situation was in Italy, how the Italians and Mussolini himself saw the question of the Jews. We first have to go back to the very beginning, when Mussolini being a Marxist and in many ways having ties to Bolshevism. And while he himself was not a Bolshevik per se, he had enough alliances and political, what do you call it? The political cause to ally himself with what we would call Bolshevism, which many would suggest, including Jews themselves, that Bolshevism was a Jewish idea, was a Jewish ideology. In fact, conservative talk show host Dennis Prager is on record as saying that Jews have been the ones that started all the isms: Marxism, Bolshevism, socialism, communism, all these ideas, as he would say, were started by Jews. And from my point of view, regardless of what you may believe that Bolshevism and communism was, I will say this, and I think this is where we can at least agree to a certain extent, and that is that there was a heavy Jewish influence within Soviet communism and Bolshevism. I think that's a fair assessment. Not here to malign the Jews in any kind of way, just saying this is what most historians now point to. And so when you come at it from that perspective, Mussolini already being anti-church, anti-Christian in his early days as a youth, getting his revolutionary zeal from his father, he's circling a lot around, sort of Jewish circles from the very origins of his young life. And this is why fascism in Italy, not Nazism, but in Italy, fascism never takes an anti-Jewish position until we get to the 1938 laws, discrimination laws, which is a whole nother thing we got to deal with later on and explain later on. But by origin, fascism was never racial. Remember, there was Jewish fascists within the regime. There was 50,000 Jews living in Italy. They lived there in peace, I should say. And they'd been there since really the time of Christ, from my understanding. When you look at fascism from its earliest origins, um, uh, you had Jews in the military. There were generals in Mussolini's military. Margherita Saffarati, one of, or at least the closest confidant of Mussolini for many years, was Jewish. Many people thought or have said that she was his lover for a while. I don't know. I can't confirm that. Some people say that. But there were Jews all around Mussolini his entire time, before, during, and after his regime in Italy. And because fascism had never had a racial element to it, um, the Jews and the Italians never had these problems. It wasn't until the failed Austrian painter comes along that we start talking about these racial divisions. Now, that all being said, we have to recognize that Jews, in many ways, in Europe at the time, were being kicked out of every country there was, right? And we could discuss why some of those things are in another podcast, but we have to recognize that the insecurity of Jews all over Europe, it existed in Italy as well, too. I wouldn't say it was perfect, but it was as perfect as can be at the time. And an administration, a fascist administration that welcomed Jews in, it was part of the administration. You had Jews in the universities during the fascist regime. You had them in top level jobs of government. You had them all over the place. And so this idea that fascism was inherently racist against Jews, it doesn't have much of an origin until we get to 1938. And again, there's political machinations there going on. For Mussolini himself, didn't have a problem with Jews. If you want more information on this, I would recommend Nicholas Farrell's book, Mussolini, A New Life. I also would recommend The Jews and Fascist Italy by Renzo Di Felice. That's another big book I have here. I read it a while back. And so, and Renzo Di Felice, who's Jewish himself, basically notes that fascism early on wasn't racist against Jews. You have to remember that. And as we move forward, while Eastern Europe is going through its difficulties, as Germany is being invaded by Bolsheviks at that time, there's something else going on in Germany that much deeper and harsher that's dividing that community. Now, the question, of course, in my mind is, when communists had invaded Italy, when the ascent of fascism starts right around 1919, 1920, and the king turns to the fascists to pull the Marxists out or push the Marxists out of Italy, how much of a Jewish element did that communism, that Marxism, that socialism in Italy had? I don't know. I can't answer that. I'm sure there was some elements of it, because what you wind up finding out, like we saw in Spain, Stalin was sending sort of his troops in, his political minions, eventually military armaments in the case of Spain. How much influence the Soviet Union had in Italy is a great question, but I know that one of the big leaders of the Communist Party after the war, Togliatti, had direct ties to the Soviet Union as he trained in his sort of Marxist activity in the Soviet Union. So there had to be some ties between the Marxism, Bolshevism of the Soviet Union to what was happening in Italy during the ascent of fascism that would eventually fight off communism and push it out of the country. Now, was there a direct link between Judaism and communism in Italy, as direct as it was going on in Germany? I don't know. I think in Germany, especially when the Bolsheviks conquered and took over Bavaria, this is long before the failed Austrian painter got into power, there was definitely a more definitive sort of perspective that Jewish Bolshevism was at root there. And so we got to remember that. And this is why Germany takes a more extreme reaction to Judaism in that region. As far as Italy, I'm not sure, But Mussolini didn't run from sort of the Jewish issue in the sense that he tried to boot all the Jews out. Again, fascism, Italian fascism was non-racist. You could be a good fascist and a good Jew. You could be a good fascist and a good Italian. It all worked as long as you accepted Italy and Italianness as your core principal ideology, as long as you were Italian. And the way Mussolini described what a good Italian was, basically you spoke Italian and you had loyalty to the nation. This is why later on with the 38 laws, and we'll have to unravel the 38 laws in another podcast, right? It's the question of Zionism that comes in and the question of loyalty to Italy, which in part is part of the issue by 1938. But in the late teens, early 20s, this question doesn't come up. Jewishness fits into Italian fascism just as much as Catholicism would to a certain degree. We have to remember that. And so, how this plays out in time, and of course, as the alliance with the failed Austrian painter becomes more codified by 1936, 37, and 38, things are going to get more tricky with the Italian regime trying to manage this alliance, an alliance that they were pushed into by the Allies who never wanted to make their peace with Mussolini. You got to remember that's important, right? The British continued to push Mussolini away, even though he was the one that set up the conferences. Which is the one I forget the I forget the one that's called. I did a podcast on it, but where Mussolini said, "Listen, if you guys are gonna come to stop Hitler, you gotta come now because I'm isolated. I'm all by myself." He's literally begging the French and the British, if we're gonna stop Hitler, we gotta come together. We gotta come together now. If you guys waffle, I'm on an island all by myself. But of course, the British and the French weren't ready to go to war just yet, right? Which left again Italy isolated, Mussolini isolated on an island to where he had to make certain political deals in order to survive. Nobody ever wants to talk about that. Nobody ever wants to mention that, but that's how that went. So though, as the narrative goes, as this alliance becomes closer, the Pact of Steel is signed, then of course you got the Jewish question. And the Germans were harsher on the Jews than the Italians were. And the Italians and Mussolini began to figure this out. The Italians were never bloodthirsty. The Italians never even wanted to be in this war. Remember, the Italians entered war because of geopolitics on the ground and how alliances sort of rise and fall together. And with the Italians, first of all, not wanting to be in the war as it was, but also they were not into imprisoning in camps Jews. They never were in favor of that. And this is why we have several instances, and this is mentioned in a lot of different books, from Renzo di Felice, The Jews in Fascist Italy, to Nicholas Farrell's Mussolini New Life, to Botched Victory by Patrick Peters, when the Italians found out about what was happening in the German camps. And that is a lot of deaths were going on. And I'm not here to make a proclamation about what was happening in those camps. What we know is there was a lot of deaths going on. And there was a sort of an uncomfortableness, if you want to call it that, by the Italians about shipping the Jews off to Germany. And this is why in several places of the war, on parts of the map that Italy controlled, it was the Italians that refused to hand over the Jews to Nazi authorities. Southeast France and Croatia being the two primary areas where the Italians did not surrender the Jews over to Hitler and the Germans. In fact, over in France, once the Germans had taken over, they allowed the Italians to kind of control a certain region in the Northeast, or excuse me, the Southeast. It was the Germans that required all the Jews to wear their Star of David so they could be identified publicly. Well, the Italian authorities that control that region immediately reversed that law so the Jews could not be identified in that region of France. And so Jews could hide out and escape persecution and ultimately shipment back to Germany. And what is fascinating is it was the French authorities, right, the liberal authorities in France that were more willing to hand over Jews to the Germans in the German-controlled regions as a way to earn brownie points. And this is why tens of thousands of French Jews were shipped off to German camps. But that just didn't happen in Southeast France in the part that the Italians control. Again, Italians were never these bloodthirsty murderers. That wasn't their forte. Okay, I know some people are saying, what about Ethiopia and Libya? Whole different story, whole different context. I've done a cast on the situation in Ethiopia. I'll eventually do one on Libya. Different situation over there. Primarily, you're dealing with jihadists over there that was giving them a lot of problems. And yes, a lot of people unfortunately died. It's a byproduct of war. Same thing that happened with all the Allied powers after the war, trying to control a region. There's nuance to these things. But in regards to the Jews in southeastern France, the Italian authorities purposely protected the Jews and refusing to hand them over. And same thing in Croatia. It was there too that the Germans continued to ask Mussolini and the Italian generals and authorities to hand over all the Jews, put them on the trains and ship them off to the German camps. And it was there where Mussolini was confronted. Was it Ribbentrop? I think it was Ribbentrop. I don't remember. When the German general asked for the Jews, primarily in Croatia, Mussolini, kind of, understanding too that Italy was losing influence and power throughout that war because militarily it was struggling. It was never ready to go to war. That was part of the problem. Mussolini's response to the German general was no objection. He did not approve and he did not object because this was a way for him to communicate to his generals basically, don't send one single Jew. Lie, delay, break the railroads, do what you got to do. Again, I'm reading this out of several sources, but in Croatia, they purposely stalled the shipment of Jews out of that area and into Germany. Again, Italians, Italy, Mussolini protected Jews as best they could. Now, after Mussolini was deposed by the king in 1943, he could no longer protect the Jews. Hell, he couldn't even protect the Italians from the Germans. Let's remember, after Mussolini was overthrown, 1943, by the Fascist Ground Council and by the king, and he gets shipped off and arrested to the top of the Gran Sasso. Hitler comes in with his gliders. He rescues Mussolini, or does he capture Mussolini? That's a big debate. But the point is, he gets a hold of Mussolini, takes him back to Germany, and basically says, listen, no, you're not going to retire, because Mussolini wanted to retire at that point. I'm not going to let you retire because I still need you. You're going back to northern Italy, and you're going to found the Republic of Salo, and you're going to put an army together, is what you're going to do. But it was a puppet regime at that point. And so Mussolini had very little power at that point. So when the Germans came for the Jews, there was very little Mussolini could do to stop that, because that's when the fascist regime gets criticized for the deaths of the Jews, especially the Italian Jews, is when Hitler came for them at the Republic of Salo. I believe it was something like 7,000 Jews were killed or were taken to the camps, and only like 100 and very small amount actually it came back from Auschwitz. I believe it was like 115 or 130, something to that effect. But what is most notable about the Republic of Salo, when Mussolini had word that the SS were coming in to capture all the Jews and ship them off to the camps, it was Mussolini that gave orders to his Secretary of Interior to give the Jews 24-hour notice. Get out, and get out now. That's about the best that he could do at the time, because he had no authority to stop this thing. He had no power to stop this thing. But he did give Jews 24 hours notice to get out, and many of them did get out, actually. And this is why the fascist regime was praised by several sources. Okay? Let's see here. Let's go to the Botched Victory. This is the Patrick Peters book here. It's a short section here. Let me read this to you, right? And this will sum it up beautifully. Quote, this is page 34, and the section is called Italian Answer to the Jewish Question. The people who suffered most from Badoglio's botched peacemaking were not ethnic Italians, they were the Jews. When joining the Axis in 1936, Mussolini never imagined that he would one day be asked to aid one of history's greatest genocides. For while the Nazi regime was always viciously racist and anti Semitic, it did not turn genocidal until after the invasion of Russia in 1941. In fact, its original policy was simply to make the Jewish lives so miserable in Germany that the Jews would leave. And leave they did, with thousands fleeing to Italy. Italian fascist authority did little to stop them. There was little anti Semitism in the bureaucracy or population at large. And the racial laws were enforced half heartedly. He's referring here to the 38 laws, right? If at all. When the 1942, the Nazi adopted the policy of systemic extermination of the Jews, they began demanding that the counties of the Axis deport their Jews to German death camps. Mussolini refused to do so, despite repeated and insistent requests. Before Badoglio's appointment as prime minister, not a single Jew was deported out of Italy. Remember that, right? When Mussolini was in power, not one single Jew, only after the king replaced Mussolini with Badoglio do we begin to see Jews being shipped out of Italy. Okay, let's continue on. More than sheltering the Jews in Italian territories, the fascist forces went out of their way to protect them in Italian occupied areas of Croatia and southeastern France. This confirmed by none other than Pierre Marie Benoit, a Capuchin friar famous for smuggling thousands of Jews out of Nazi occupied France. This heroic apostolate earned him a nickname, Father of the Jews, and official recognition as a righteous among the nations after the war. In July 1943, meeting with Pius XII, Father Benoit praised the fascist authorities in Italian occupied France for actively protecting the Jews from both the Nazis and the French collaborators. Father Benoit spoke highly of their humane conduct, which did great honor to the Italian nation. He was less impressed with the Allies, who had limited themselves to making speeches and threats rather than helping the Jews in a concrete way. So, according to Father Benoit, the father of the Jews and the righteous among the nations, the persecuted Jews of Europe got more help from Italian fascists than from the Allies. But Mussolini could protect the Jews only as long as his government remained independent. As the president of the semi puppet RSI, he struggled to protect even Italians, never mind the Jews, from the Nazi atrocities. After the occupation of northern Italy, the Germans, with the aid from the RSI, began putting the Jews onto Holocaust trains. Still, the survival rate of Italy's Jews, 83%, was the second highest in Axis occupied Europe. The only country which did better was Denmark, where most of the Jews were simply smuggled away to neutral Sweden before the Nazis could catch them. End quote. That's page 134, 135. Patrick Peters' book, Botch Victory, How World War II Caused Vatican II and Corrupted the Christian West. And so that's a short summary. You can read more details again in the other books that I mentioned here, but we have to be careful with history because as Westerners, as Americans, as English speaking Protestant liberals, and that's what really the Allies were in the West, right? That aligned with the Soviet Union, we've been given a post World War II narrative that gives us sort of that, what do you want to call it? That fairy tale version of history when World War II was much more nuanced. And I would say, too, to a certain degree, it was much more nuanced even on the German front. And so we have to be careful with history because most people have this very low level colloquial understanding of World War II. As you guys know, in this series, I've gone much deeper than that and I tried to explain some of the nuances here and to simply blame the Italians for collaborating and being mass murderers. It doesn't match up with the historical record and the historical narrative. The Italians were not mass murderers. The Italians never had all these massive death camps. Yes, they had some prisons. I know people are going to bring that up, right? Because guys like who's the famous comics? I forget his name now, the famous Italian communist, Gramsci, Antonio Gramsci died in a prison, right? So people are going to point to that. Well, I don't know if Gramsci was a good guy. Let's go there, right? Because now we've all been infected by this cultural Marxism that originates with Antonio Gramsci. But that's beside the point here. So, I recently received a comment in one of my videos saying that the Italians were a bunch of degenerates because they helped exterminate a bunch of people during World War II along with the Nazis. Again, that's an inaccurate historical uh, what do you want to call it? Description. It just didn't work that way. And let's remember again the 35,000 Italians that were murdered by the Germans in the Republic of Salo in order to try and quell the rebellion that was happening there with the partisans. The Germans were brutal against Italians, and Mussolini couldn't even stop that. Then you had another 15,000 Italians murdered by Tito and his communist forces in the northeast of Italy. The Italians suffered a great deal for being in this mess. And as I said before, their entrance into the war was much more nuanced. I know that's not popular because we have the bad guy, everybody's Hitler narrative for every war that America and the West fights, right? This is, again, a propaganda trick that originates in the British Empire where everybody takes the higher moral authority. We're the good guys, they're the bad guys, right? Kind of a thing. But when you look at World War II, there was lots of issues going on in Europe. The first of which I don't believe America ever should have got involved with. And then when it comes to the Jewish question, it's very complex. It's a sad tragedy, without a doubt. But as I said before, there's nuances there. To try and blame the Italians for being the mass murderer of Jews, it just doesn't work historically. You can't prove it. It's all been shot down throughout history. I mean, even listen, I've listened to these academics, talk about the 7,000 Jews that were shipped off to, I believe it was Auschwitz, and trying to blame the Italian authorities because there was some Italians that were looking to um, rise up sort of the Nazi sort of ladder of power. It was obvious that Mussolini had become the the beta, Hitler had become the alpha, and there were a few Italians, not a lot of them. There was a few piece of shit Italians, don't get me wrong. I'll be the first to tell you that jumped on the SS Nazi bandwagon because they saw where the power was going to be after the war was over. The if the Axis powers had won the war, but that was a very, very, very small sort of amount of Italians that were simply looking for a career opportunity, which is disgraceful, which was pointed out in books like The Jews in Fascist Italy by Renzo De Felice. But that was an extreme minority, and it wasn't Mussolini, and generally it wasn't the fascist regime at the time. So we have to keep these things in context. I think I'm gonna leave it here for now. It's a short cast. It's a basic, simple summary that I've given you. There's more to this. Like I said, we have to go through the 38 racial discrimination laws, which is another issue in and of itself. But even here, Patrick Peters mentioned, were those laws really enforced or were they half-assed simply to appease Hitler? We could discuss that another time. Once again, Mussolini, an Italian American perspective. This is Frank. I want to thank you for joining me tonight. Signing off. Good night, everybody.